one thing is that I feel like oftentimes when I'm having conversations about the sex trade with my friends, they oftentimes conflate female empowerment and sex positivity with the sex trade or this idea of sex work. And I just wanted to kind of hear what everybody had to say about that.
I mean, I think part of that conflation is stemming from this visible narrative that we get. For example, a lot of very positive movements like the Me Too movement and like other media campaigns that focus on empowering women and like feminist stories are really the only visible story that we get, the one that we get to hear, the one we get to engage with, the one that we get to really promote. But ultimately, we don't actually get the narrative of those who are highly traumatized, those who are not in a position to speak out publicly about their experiences in the sex trade and how they've been so severely traumatized, even disabled, following their experience or throughout their experience in commercial sex.
Absolutely. And I think such a large part, and I think our generation kind of falls at the intersection of like, we grew up in the thick of the Me Too movement. So consent specifically, like, I think in an educational setting has really been taught to us, and even just at home, we were really taught this idea of consent and how important it is. But when we talk about the sex trade, somehow that whole conversation is left out. And so I think that when we, when sex positivity is conflated with the idea of the sex trade, I think we have to remember, what is sex? What is needed, for something to actually be consensual in a sexual interaction. I think it's the both participants willing to be there. And in the sex trade, everything is transactional, and there is that exchange of money, and we have to remember that money ultimately is coercive. And so it's inherently dangerous for us to kind of really build on this idea that in order to be sex positive, you have to support the sex trade because they contradict each other. So I think it's so important to remember, what we've known about consent and not leave it out of the conversation, and make sure, specifically when we're talking about the sex trade, when there is that power dynamic, there is that vulnerability of the majority of people in the sex trade, and there is money involved, that we really have to examine the lack of consent that exists.
And I think the idea also of what is consent exactly, because if we're thinking about trading sex, not just for money, but even food, money to buy food, a place to stay, money to buy a place to stay, is that consent? If we are trading sex for basic needs, if we're trading money for sex for, yes, if we're trading sex essentially for survival, is that consent? Is that person really willing to be doing what they're doing?
And I feel like we have to take this conversation back a few years, because most people who enter the sex trade have experiences of child sexual abuse.
Right.
So at that point, no child can really be included in a conversation about consent, because there is no consent at that point. They're legally abused and legally raped when they have been sexually abused as children. And that becomes this background, this kind of undercurrent for the rest of their lifetime, where they may continue in engaging in commercial sex, exploited in throughout their entire life. All of it from this journey of trauma that began at such a young age.
And as a result, the average age of entry into the sex trade is around like 13 years old. So you enter the sex trade as a minor, which legally you're a sex trafficking victim if you're under the age of 18. But when you turn 18, you don't fall under the legal definition anymore, or at least you don't do it as easily, right? And so I think it's so dangerous to think that even if you entered when you were a minor, automatically when you're 18, you're considered to have complete agency over the decision and the situation you're in. I think that is something that is not talked about enough.
And even for, people, and I'll use the word children because the law recognizes a person as not an adult until the age of 18. But even people and children that are of the age of sexual consent, what is the difference between 17 and 18 mentally?
Yeah.
And how do we translate that into the conversation of consent?
Yeah, I think too often that people have conversations around supporting the sex trade and quote unquote sex work and the conflation that Marie was talking about between sex positivity and the sex trade it's often conversations happening amongst privileged people, right? Especially in academia, for example, right? We're not really conceptualizing like who are these people in the sex trade, right? We can talk all we want about ways in which we can incorporate consent into the sex trade, but the reality of the situation is if we're really talking about, let's say, students in a classroom having this conversation, there's probably not someone in that room who's engaged in prostitution, right? So let's break it down in a way that people in our generation who don't have a direct connection to prostitution can understand it. Say, I'm with my boyfriend. He says, I want to have sex. I say, I'm not in the mood right now. And he says, what if I pay for dinner? And then I'm like, oh, well, I actually don't have money for dinner. So, I mean, if I just have sex with him and then he'll take me out, I guess that's an okay exchange.
And I'm sure your friends will see the red flag in that.
Right, exactly, right? You're having that conversation, is very easy to see, okay, that's coercive, right? Because you wouldn't have sex with them if it weren't for the monetary gain.
For dinner.
Yeah. Right, for dinner, right? And let's say I don't eat if he doesn't pay for my dinner, right? We're talking about basic human needs. Like that's obviously a situation in which sex was coerced. And what is coerced sex? Rape. Right? Yeah. So but nobody applies this logic that I feel like our generation basically understands as consent, right? Like Georgia was talking about, as an extension of the Me Too movement and more wide spread education about consent, that we can understand that in our day-to-day interactions and what is often very privileged interactions. But when it's applied to the sex trade, which, like Maria talked about earlier, is mostly centers around marginalized communities and people who don't have any other option, imagine what it's like to have sex with people you are not attracted to have sex with people you don't want to have sex with because you need the money that they're providing. And so oftentimes the people who we work with will say she will always need the money more than he needs the orgasm. And I think that power dynamic is so important to recognize.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a lot of surface level generalization and missing nuance using classifications like being 18 versus being 17. We definitely know the stories of people involved are very widely varied, and what's important is this common system that propagates all of these really adverse and well-documented effects that we've been talking about.
Right. Ultimately, we could agree that female empowerment, if we were to use this generalized term, does not mean having PTSD. It does not mean being abused. It does not mean having lifelong detriments to your mental health. It does not mean severe traumatic brain injury. It does not mean the extension and like the long list of injuries that incapacitate most people who are survivors and victims of commercial sex.
Right. So when we're conflating sex positivity with the sex trade, it's a positive sexual experience for who? The most privileged, right? So when to generalize, like you were saying, and talk about sex trade and sex positivity as if they're one and the same, what that's effectively doing is whitewashing the system of prostitution. It's whitewashing sex work, right? We're having these very privileged conversations, and oftentimes the stories that we're hearing most from are white women, right? Are people who have financial privilege, who have access to resources, who can enter and exit the sex trade at will.
I was just gonna say that, you were talking about all the things that female empowerment is not, and I think what we're all talking about is that ultimately, sex positivity and female empowerment is about having a choice. And what we know is that the sex trade is a choiceless choice. The majority of people there are there because of a lack of choice, the lack of opportunity. So I think that is what we need to remember. It's all about choice, and a choice is free from coercion.